Okay, so this week we once again looking at the question of children and violence, and we had been talking about corporal punishment and bullying and the different perspectives on those issues. But there's more to explore on this the question, and it's really interesting to look at children as either as victims of violence, but also possibly as perpetrators of violence, because it seems that that's one thing people often get really alarmed by when young people commit brutal crimes or engage in acts of violence or are vicious and bullying in different ways. It seems that we have an expectation that children shouldn't do that. But that's not the primary focus today. We're going to look at something else because remember, we've been trying to extend our notion of violence, and we certainly did this with corporal punishment. We really raised the question, well, at what point do we think of things that might have previously been thought of as simply forms of discipline as actually being forms of violence? And we're going to think about that today. But one of the things we're going to look at quite carefully today is the relation between the idea of violence and the idea of neglect of children. Now, it's interesting looking at violence in childhood because you already know by now that one of the things the media does and people do is they tend to look at external threats. They tend to, it's like the apex gang or terrorists or serial killers. We really tend to focus on these kind of external things, sexual assaults that happen, in outside in sort of dark public places, street crime. But in fact, we know that much violence happens in the home and much violence happens between people who are actually very close to each other. But it seems in some ways those kinds of things are harder to talk about and harder to recognize. So there's some forms of risks to children that we're very clear about. We certainly acknowledge bullying as a problem. We certainly have a great concern about children being sexually assaulted and children being injured in various ways. But the other, perhaps less visible, more subtle forms of violence that we need to recognize. In addition to that, there's something else that's really interesting. Is this question of whether and how childhood experiences can go on to influence the extent to which people may then become at risk of becoming perpetrators of violence themselves. And this is really interesting. I mean, if you remember when we were talking about bullies, for instance, we talked about the way in which people who had been bullied often ended up identifying with the bullies and ended up being the ones who were at risk of becoming bullies themselves. So that's the kind of question we're really raising at the moment. And it's interesting when you look at popular media, often, in the typical kind of like serial killer narrative, there'll be like flashbacks to the person's childhood, and we'll see them being physically beaten or something as a child, and we'll be like, aha. So we see there's like the reason this person turns out to be brutal, violent, criminal in this way is because they had this terrible experience. And this idea sort of floats around in popular culture, and we accept it. But what actually is inside that idea? What is the kind of theory that is linking something bad happening in childhood and something bad happening in adulthood, but where there's a reversal, where the victim ends up becoming a perpetrator? How does that process actually work? So we want to unpack that and see if we can make sense of it in a little more detail. Okay, so that means we've got to look at this question of cycles of violence. This is a fundamental question. One of the things that we recognize is that children who are exposed to violence are at risk of becoming violent offenders themselves. Okay. Now we need to be very clear about that claim. That is not a simple cause and effect claim. It's not a simple like if A then B. If I flick the switch, the light will come on. Because certainly many children who are exposed to violence do not become violent offenders. Very clear that it's not like if the one thing happens, the other thing happens. But it is like so many other things. It's about increased risk rather than simple absolute causal relationship. You know, in the same way that, you know, if you drink and drive, you may not be in an accident, you may not hurt anyone, but it does increase the likelihood. If you're in close proximity to people without observing social distancing or wearing a face covering, you may not infect them, they may not infect you, but there's a much higher risk in the context of a pandemic. So it's really about risk rather than predictive power. We can't predict that if someone is exposed to a particular kind of experience, they will end up doing a particular kind of thing. But we do notice patterns of increased risk. So, and this is where the idea of a cycle of violence comes in. That if we expose vulnerable young people to certain kinds of experience, we're creating greater risks of violence within the society. And that's exactly what we said about corporal punishment last week. We said that one of the reasons we don't think corporal punishment is a good idea, because for various reasons, it actually leads people to behave antisocially later on. It doesn't make them more law-abiding and obedient. In fact, it tends to have the opposite effect. And that's exactly the kind of thing we want to. So how does this idea of a cycle of violence, of a victim becoming a perpetrator, actually work? Now, there's a number of different possible theoretical frameworks that could explain that. And there's three that I want to just identify for you. There's a kind of a social learned behavior approach. There's a kind of a trauma approach, and there's an emotional development and attachment theory approach. So the learned behavior approach is quite simple. People learn how to be violent. It's not something that, you know, it's just inside them. They see other people becoming violent. They see how to become violent. They see how, you know, how you fight, how you use weapons. They see when people use them. And so they learn it like anything else. They learn it the way they learn to tie their shoes or put on their clothes or brush their teeth. They simply observe the people around them. So a child growing up in a family where one of the partners is violent to the other will grow up thinking that is how one interacts in that sort of relationship. So this idea of learned behavior is an important piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding cycles of violence, but it's not the only way of looking at it. There's another approach which looks at the idea of repressed trauma. And this is what we talked about when we're discussing bullies as being a psychodynamic approach. This has to do with the psychoanalytic idea of experiences becoming unconscious and then change and then emerging in other forms. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the third one, which we'll also talk about towards the second half of this lecture, is the emotional development model, which we will talk about as attachment theory. And this says that experiences of abuse, and not only what we think of as abuse, but also what we typically classify as neglect, produce forms of emotional attachment that leave people at greater risk of being perpetrators of violence, and I'll explain that to you later. So these are the three: the learned behavior one, which we kind of explained already. It's very simple. The psychoanalytic repressed trauma model and the emotional development attachment theory model. Okay, so let's look at that repressed trauma model. And now what you need to be thinking back to the Bullies, Sissies and Crybabies paper that you've already read last week. And the way in which that idea of what do people do with difficult experiences, okay? What happens when people have very, very negative, overwhelmingly bad experiences? And we notice a couple of things within this framework, and this is a psychoanalytic framework, okay? Firstly, people are not always aware of their emotions. This is a really important thing. Like often, what's known as sort of cognitive approaches in psychology assume Firstly, that people sort of behave in a kind of conscious, rational way, that they're aware of what they're doing. And it's really their thoughts that shape their emotions. This theory doesn't make those assumptions. Okay, so one of the things that it takes from the outset as a principle is that people actually don't always understand themselves. They don't always know what's going on inside themselves. They don't always even know what they're feeling. And they can't, and even with very, very intense experiences, in fact, sometimes even more with very intense experiences, they don't really understand what's going on with them. And often they misrecognize their feelings. And they when they start having a feeling, they think it's something which is kind of unrelated. So they'll start feeling a particular emotion, and they will experience that as being, oh, some person being hostile to them, when in fact that person isn't being hostile to them. Something like that. They'll perceive it as being different from what it is. And very often that perception is they'll see their feeling as being caused by something or someone outside themselves rather than being something inside themselves. And often that leads to perhaps a kind of a paranoid experience of the world. Okay. Now, we've said already that one of the things people need to do is protect themselves from overwhelming negative experiences. And the stress there is overwhelming. There's some negative experience, you can be frustrated, you can be angry, but some things are overwhelming. And this is particularly true for infants and young children, is their experiences are very intense. And they don't have a kind of a clear structure for them. And they easily feel overwhelmed by things that an adult might find quite manageable. But sometimes there are things that anyone would feel overwhelmed by. So the psychoanalytic theory says that essentially what people do with those overwhelming feelings is they try not to be aware of them. They try to make that experience go away. And depending on the particular approach within trauma theory, that's described as dissociation, a kind of disconnecting of that experience from conscious awareness. Psychoanalytic theory rather uses the term repression. They say it gets pushed out of awareness. So dissociation, the mental model there is one of things breaking apart, like a puzzle breaking into pieces, whereas repression is more like the idea of kind of burying something, but it's essentially the same idea. Okay, now here's the thing. This is the critical thing to understand, is that the dissociation and the repression don't work. That is what is important in these theories, is that when you push something out of awareness, it doesn't actually go away. It just isn't, you just aren't conscious of it, but it's still there and it still influences you. And exactly the way you remember, Gilligan said the important thing, we've all got a theory of violence, but mostly we don't know what our theory is. And because we don't know what our theory is, we can't understand it and we can't check whether it's true or not. Similarly, when people force experiences out of their awareness, they can't understand them. They can't say, oh, that thing actually makes me feel like this. So they have they sort of go into states of rage or panic or feeling sick or whatever the reaction is, but it doesn't make immediate sense. It's not like they're like, oh, I'm feeling this feeling because of that experience that I had before, because that's exactly what's not in consciousness. So the real risk here, of course, is that these powerful emotional states exist in this kind of chaotic, disruptive way, and they come out in weird moments. They come out when the person cuts you off in the traffic, or when the partner breaks up with you, or when your kids are screaming and won't calm down. They come out in these sort of like high stress situations, and they come out sort of chaotically and incomprehensibly and overwhelmingly. And that's the real risk with these things that have been repressed or dissociation. The risk is not, them being pushed out of consciousness. The risk is them returning in a form that is incomprehensible and unmanageable. that's the danger. And it's in those moments, it's when those feelings return in those ways, that the risk of not only being overwhelmed, but of potentially perhaps becoming destructive and violent, self-destructive, violent towards other people in those situations. Okay, so this is a common thing. So if people have accumulated a lot of these overwhelming traumatic experiences, and if they've had to keep them out of awareness, if they haven't had the kind of support that allowed them to reintegrate, to become aware of, to understand those experiences, they're going to carry on existing in that precarious way. And it's interesting because people tend to do one of two things, or one of both. Sometimes they deliberately do the things that actually trigger those memories, like deliberately put themselves in situations where like that bad experience will be kind of recalled, to try and create a situation where they can manage it, or they try and avoid them completely. And one of the things that we talked about in the Bullies, Sissies and Crybabies paper is one of the things to do with an experience of victimization is to instead of feeling like the victim, to imagine, to get rid of that experience by imagining oneself as the perpetrator and trying to become like the perpetrator, trying to idealize them, become like them, treat other vulnerable people the way that perpetrator treated you. And that's the process we referred to then as identification with the aggressor. So if you're not completely familiar with that, go back and look at it again, because it's really important to understand that identification with the aggressor. And of course, the important thing is to understand people don't deliberately do that. They don't sit down and say, if I become like that person, I won't feel this vulnerability. It's purely a kind of an automatic defense mechanism to manage feeling overwhelmed. Okay, so that's really the essence of this, of the trauma theory or the psychoanalytic approach, is this idea that the overwhelming experience gets pushed out of awareness, but they come back. They tend to come back in crisis situations. They lead to these sort of chaotic, overwhelming feelings, anger, jealousy, terror, panic. And there's a high risk that will lead to either harm towards other people or harm towards themselves in that situation. Okay, so let's move on then to having looked at that psychoanalytic framework, to the attachment theory framework, the emotional development framework. And here we are reading that chapter called The Hand That Rocks, from the book Ghosts from the Nursery by Carl Morse and Wiley. And this whole book is about the way in which sort of certain harmful childhood experiences can actually lead people to become aggressive and dangerous. And in fact, the subtitle of the book is The Roots of Violence in Child Rearing. So it's really interesting. And often in criminology, we look at much more sociological models of why people become at risk of being offenders. But this one is really a more psychological model. But it's not simply a psychological model, because remember what we said, and this is in both, right at the beginning of the course, in Gilligan and in Stanko, we said that we need a biopsychosocial model, a model that integrates the biological, what people are physically, with a psychological model, with a social model. So what is what is the biological? And this is the physiological elements. This may be that childhood may be structured both for the infant and for the caregivers by experiences of illness, experiences of poor nutrition, experiences of being exposed to toxic substances. And it may, there's a certain amount of it may be genetic. The person may have genetic capacities. So that's the kind of bio part of it. The social part of it is the socioeconomic factors. So there may be a number of external stresses. When the child may grow up in a society in conflict, a politically repressive or civil war society, or genocide, or society structured by racism or homophobia or sexism in a way that creates ongoing threats to them, that they have to live in fear of police brutality, sexual assault, racist violence towards themselves. So that's the social, and a lot of the social is also economic. A lot of it has to do with the unequal distribution of resources, that to be in a well-resourced environment where there's parents are employed, there's social welfare, there's health and psychological support services, that material conditions are quite comfortable, is very different from growing up in a situation of deprivation, of poverty, lack of social services, lack of health services. All of those create massive stresses. So that's the social part. But we want to look more deeply at the psychological part. Okay, so a couple of interesting points. Research studies have shown that looking at homicidal children who have either who behave in ways that actually threaten the lives of others, that 96% of them come from what are described as chaotic family backgrounds. We must look at that word chaotic much more in much more detail later. 96%, that's pretty much all. I mean, that's a very, very, very high percentage in terms of our normal social sciences kind of correlations. 81% of them, which is also extraordinarily high for a social correlation, come from violent family backgrounds. So overwhelmingly, most of them come from violent backgrounds, and just about all of them come from chaotic family backgrounds. Okay, so what's going on with that? And this is where, is this social learning? Is it repressed trauma? Has it got to do with psychological attachment? Okay, so but let's look at the attachment part of it. So the earliest relationships that a developing infant and young child experiences have an impact on a number of things. Firstly, they have an impact on the development of empathy, the ability to identify with other people, feel what they're feeling, understand what their experience is. The development of empathy, and that is linked to then emotional attachment to other people. Secondly, that those early experiences also very strongly influence the extent to which people can manage their emotions versus having overwhelming feelings. And this, of course, when you think about that trauma model, the risk of having suddenly overwhelming, unmanageable feelings, but also it affects the development of what we call higher cognitive capacities, the ability to understand what's going on, to look at a situation and say, oh, wait a minute, that's what's going on here. If I do this, it'll escalate it. If I do that, it'll de-escalate it. Maybe this is a better way of resolving the situation than that. So that requires ability to understand and conceptualize and take thoughtful decisions about consequences. And all of those are really important to understanding moments of violence. Okay, so attachment theory then. This work comes out of the writing of a psychologist called John Bowlby, and he developed what is now known as attachment theory. Okay, and essentially what this is saying is that the very earliest relationship, the earliest caregiver relationship, and we're talking about the first few months even, definitely, and certainly the first few years of life, shape our sense of self and our relationships through adulthood. And to understand this, we've got to, like, imagine a baby, like, and one of the interesting things with babies is the way in which they feel things very intensely, and that they move very suddenly between feeling kind of okay. You know, they've baby's just been fed, it's falling asleep, it's kind of blissed out, and everything's nice. And then it can quite rapidly go into a terrible state of distress, and just be howling, and so this shift between sort of states, these benign states of comfort and these states of distress, these really define what it is to be a baby. And the thing we've got to imagine, this is really hard to imagine, is that babies don't know what's going on. We know what's going on, but like we know, like, oh, I feel sore, I better move, or I'm so hungry, I better have something to eat, or geez, it's cold outside, let me put on something warmer. I mean, we like, those are the most obvious kind of things that we just know. But interestingly, babies have to learn that stuff. And to them, the experiences are very immediate, they're very incomprehensible, but they're very overwhelming. And that's why you see infants going into such distressed states, is the sense of overwhelmingness and incomprehensibility. So let's look at what's happening. Okay, baby's been sleeping, wakes up, and it's very upset. Maybe the nappy's wet, maybe it's very hungry, maybe it's become terribly physically uncomfortable, and it just starts screaming. And what happens at that point? Okay, there's three different things that Bowlby identified. Firstly, the caregiver sees the infant in distress and responds and says, "Oh, what's wrong? Oh, you've messed your nappy. Let me change it." And caregiver change the nappy, caresses the infant, make sure it's comfortable again. State of distress goes away. Okay, so gone from relaxation to distress, back to relaxation. At the same time, so has the caregiver. Caregiver was like, "Oh, nice, baby sleeping. Oh my God, baby's freaking out. Let me do something. Oh, fixed it. Baby's calm again, I'm calm again." And so you have this positive, this cycle of relaxation, a positive caring cycle. And this is what we want. This is the good stuff that leads to good emotional development, is caregiver that is present, that is responsive, that understands, that is physically there, that isn't, passed out on drugs, that isn't having to work and leave the kids at home, that is able to seize the child in distress, doesn't freak out, doesn't then start having a panic attack themselves and like, "Oh, well, I need a drink." Tunes into the baby, so understands this. "Oh, I know. Oh, this is how she acts when she's hungry. This is how she acts when she's uncomfortable. Oh, I'll work it out. I'll work out what she needs." Tunes in, responds appropriately, fixes the state of distress, creates the positive caring cycle. Okay, and a whole lot of different good things happen there, which we'll talk about. Okay, alternative scenario, and I'm going to give you two alternative scenarios. Okay, baby goes into state of distress, nothing happens. Okay, parents are passed out drunk, or some situation has arisen. So the baby just feels total unmanageable catastrophic distress, traumatic distress, which it then can't do anything with. It can't fix it itself. It can't. It's too much. And this is the kind of like traumatic distress that might relate to that trauma theory. Okay, so that's a possible outcome. And this would be the situation of neglect. When the infant goes into distress, the distress is overwhelming and unmanageable because no positive caring cycle is implemented, and the infant is just left with the unmanageable, overwhelming experience. Okay? Or third scenario, baby goes into state of distress, starts screaming, and there is a negative response. The angry parents just give the child a slap or shake it or respond aggressively in a way that increases the distress. So that the already distressed infant is now thrown into like pain, terror. The experience becomes even worse, okay? And that's what we would define as the abusive situation, okay? So there it's not just a neglectful situation, it's actual, the caregiver intervenes to make the situation worse. And there we have abuse taking place. Okay, so I want you to think carefully about those three: about the positive cycle, about the neglectful cycle, and about the abusive cycle. Okay, now the reason is that these patterns lead to what we call attachment styles. They lead to kinds of relationships with the caregivers. And the person who looked at this originally was Dr. Mary Ainsworth. And she developed a weird experiment called the strange situation. And it's very simple. Simply, babies, 12 to 18 months, put them in a room with the mom and let them play. And then what you do is you get the mother to leave the room for a little while and to go back in the room. That's the whole of the strange situation, okay? The most common experience for any child. Be sort of around the primary caregiver, caregiver has to do something else, caregiver comes back. And what she did, she identified 4 different patterns, 4 different kinds of reaction in this situation, okay? So, firstly, and these are what are referred to as attachment styles, and you may have studied them before, in which case this may seem like repetition, but I want you to think about it with respect to its relevance to violence, okay? Both the experience of abuse and the risk of becoming a violent offender. Okay, so secure attachment, 70% of the kids, when they're in the room with the mom, they play around, they get in their own little play world, but they keep checking in with the mom. Oh, mom's still there, fine, carry on playing. When she leaves the room, they're very unhappy and they're distressed, maybe they cry a bit. Then when she comes back, then they're like filled with happiness. They make contact with the mom again. Oh, you're back, I feel safe, everything's good. That's secure attachment. Distress when the caregiver leaves, happiness when the caregiver returns, but a sense of being able to also play independently and feel content in themselves when the caregiver is sort of present in the background, even if they're not paying immediate attention to them. Okay, secure attachment. Next one, which you called ambivalent attachment. Okay, so child and the mom are in the room, and the child is clingy. The child doesn't sort of get engrossed in its own explorations and its own games. It needs to be close to the mother all the time. So it seems to be fearful of kind of letting go and getting into its own imaginative world. When the mother leaves, the child's terribly distressed. But when she comes back, the reaction is different when she returns. Okay. Is the child isn't happy to see her, does not move towards her, does not seek being comforted, like, oh, you were gone, now you're back, now it's all better. There's a resistance to that kind of reconciliation, and this ambivalent attachment style, where the child's clingy, but then when it feels abandoned, then it doesn't try and reestablish the connection. It feels too stressed out and upset, is associated with a kind of inconsistent caregiving style, where the mother is not consistently responsive and available and caring. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Okay, so that's the ambivalent attachment style. Then there's the avoidant attachment style. So here the mom and the kid are in the room, and the kid pretty much ignores the mom, just does their own thing in their own little world. Mom goes out, kid doesn't really react much, carries on doing whatever they're doing. Mom comes back, and the kid just ignores her. And so there's actually very little connection between them. There's like the kid has made themselves independent in their own world already, coming and going with the mom. It's not doesn't have huge impact on them. The avoidant attachment style is associated with where the parents are either completely unavailable or unresponsive, that they're either simply not present in the child's caregiving, or that they don't respond to the child's states of distress. They perhaps feed the child at a certain time, put it to bed at a certain time, regardless of what the child's actually feeling. If it's screaming, they ignore it. It's just like there's a routine, but there's no responsiveness. There's no kind of empathic connection. The fourth type is the disorganized attachment. Okay, and here the emphasis is on this element of disorganization. Okay, so the child's in the room playing, mom's there, mom leaves, mom comes back, and when the mother comes back, the child has kind of chaotic emotions. They may feel scared or sad, or and so there's neither just the ignoring of the mom, nor is it like seeking being comforted by the mom, feeling okay again. There's this kind of mixture of anxiety, fear, all kinds of things, and this is associated with caregiving where the caregivers have not protected the child and perhaps have actively threatened the child in a certain way. Okay, so here the sense is that the child is the disorganization is this mixture of kind of needing something, but actually being scared of the people who're supposed to provide it, like needing attention, needing care, but knowing that, but if I try and get it, something bad's going to happen, or I don't know what's going to happen. It's too chaotic. So there's this kind of sort of chaos of conflicting feelings of need, but also fear. And this is really most typically associated with children who've experienced abuse. It's also most associated with children who are at risk of becoming violent in later life. Okay, so what are these attachment styles? What these caregiving styles do to the child? Okay. So the child that's experienced the secure attachment, that has experienced that positive cycle that I talked about, learns that firstly that experiences can be shared, that they can understand, other people can understand them, they can learn to understand other people. People can kind of work together positively. They can communicate, they can collaborate. Things can be good between people. But also the important thing is that experiences can be manageable, that you can feel distress, that something can be bad, but in the context of trust and caring of other people, those things don't have to be terrifying, they don't have to be overwhelming, they can just be difficult, they don't have to be repressed, they don't have to become traumatic. They can be managed even though they're difficult. But the important thing is that the sort of sharing, the collaboration, and the manageability, okay, versus the kind of non-responsive, where the caregivers don't respond to the distress of the child, or that perhaps they're negative responses when the child's screaming, it gets a slap or gets punished in some way, gets locked in the cupboard, something weird. That makes the situation even worse. Okay, now two things go wrong, and this is really, really important for us to understand. Two things go wrong in this situation. Firstly, the child doesn't get the feeling that its emotions are manageable. It gets a feeling that if a bad feeling starts happening, that feeling is terrifying and overwhelming. Nothing can fix it. No one's going to help. And so the child develops with this kind of terror of those feelings. But remember, that's not necessarily a conscious thing. That isn't like, oh, I need to avoid ever feeling that. It's more like I'll push that out of my mind, and if there's any risk of ever feeling it, I'll just totally go crazy. The other thing, so what we refer to there is that negative feelings are unregulated. They feel overwhelming. They can't be regulated by the child themselves. But also the connection to other people, the realization that other people can feel what you're feeling and you can learn the capacity to feel what they're feeling. That the ability for empathy doesn't develop there because there isn't an empathic connection in the neglectful or abusive relationships. And so here, these two problems is a difficulty regulating negative emotions and the limited capacity for empathy actually make it difficult for the child to understand what is expected of them, how to interact with other people in a pro-social way that helps them, but also that they have difficulty controlling, like when they feel angry or jealous or abandoned or humiliated, those feelings become chaotic. So they tend to go into sort of overwhelmed states, and typically in those overwhelmed states may act very badly. They might, so say for instance at school, they might feel humiliated when they're asked a question that they can't answer and become very destructive, start breaking things, start wanting to fight. Thinking like, oh, that person's laughing at me or mocking me, and just become enraged and just want to beat them up and destroy them. So these kind of negative feelings, then great risk of coming out as antisocial acts, but of kind of impulsive, overwhelming antisocial acts. But then that link to the limited capacity for empathy and the expectation of hostility, humiliation from other people. The limited expectation that people are kind of decent and kind and will help you if you need, because that's not what's been experienced. So this limited empathy and difficulty regulating negative emotions really creates an escalating pattern where the child may find themselves increasingly in trouble at school, in trouble in the neighborhood, and then as the kid then becomes a teenager, then eventually in trouble with the law for, getting into fights or doing antisocial things, or feeling like, well, no one's going to look after me, so I've got to look after myself. And I've got no cash, so I'll just steal stuff. Any of those kinds of things can be ways of sort of managing these difficult emotions and difficult life conditions. Okay, so how do we need to think about that in relation to the question of violence? And this is where I'm ending today's video. Is all of this stuff we will talk. The reason we're talking about all of this psychological stuff, because we want to say what is the relevance for us understanding people's risk of being violent and the impact of certain forms of violence. Okay. So remember, we said that our kind of model, our main model of sort of criminal justice is actually a kind of a punitive model built on that rational self-interest theory. It's the idea of, well, don't do that or we'll punish you. And the idea of like, oh, so what we need to do with people who are violent is to punish them. What we need to do with kids who get into who fight with other kids is give them a hiding, or if they're teenagers and they're getting into, they're going to Moomba Festival and getting into a big fight with a bunch of other kids, we need to put them in jail or cancel their visas and send them back to a war-torn country. So it's kind of punitive model, okay? And what we're saying here is that model fundamentally misunderstands where the violence comes from. It fundamentally understands what the violence is, what triggers it, and what would disincentivize it. Okay, so in a sense, we're saying two things. That failure to develop empathy by having repeated, consistent, empathic caregiving means that the main thing that stops people hurting other people, which is not deterrence, okay? We need to be really clear about it. It isn't the fear of going to jail that every single day stops people hurting. In extreme situations, yes, it does. But mostly the reason people don't just treat each other abusively is because they feel connected to other people. It's nicer to do something nice for someone than to be mean to them. People actually feel in themselves, I'd rather, like, stop and let you cross the road than just drive through you, because it wouldn't feel nice to hurt you. And so it's really empathy that connects people and moderates their frustrated and angry and jealous impulses. So it's not that they don't have those feelings, it's that those feelings are managed by kind of a background of like, oh, but if I hurt you, that will actually really be bad. It will feel bad for you and it'll make me feel bad, okay? And the deterrence model, the punitive model, doesn't really understand that, in fact, the more effective way of managing violence in society is to harness empathy than to terrorize people with fear of punishment. The other thing is that even fear of punishment, even the deterrence, is in fact linked to an empathy towards oneself. Deterrence only works for people who care about themselves, for people who like, oh, I really don't want to feel bad things. I'm going to organize my life so that in the future I won't feel a lot of bad things. That means you've already internalized a kind of empathy towards yourself. You already are capable of self-care. You're already capable of saying, well, I don't mind being frustrated now because it'll be better in the long term. Like a person who feels overwhelmed by negative, complicated emotions can't do that and can't tune into, oh, well, let me not do this now. Let me not get into a rage and smash these things now because it will lead to negative consequences for me. So without empathy, instrumental violence becomes more dangerous. And remember, earlier in the talk, we talked about instrumental and expressive violence. Instrumental violence is the kind of, and it's sort of mistaken really, but the way people think violence normally happens is people are violent in order to achieve a goal. This is the rational self-interest. Okay, I want money. I'm going to get a knife. I'm going to go down the street and mug people. That's instrumental violence. I'm going to use violence to get something. I want oil. I'm going to send my army in to kill the president of that country and bomb the civilians and take their oil away. All of those kinds of things. Like, I'm going to use violence to get the thing I want, and it's just a tool. It's a cold-blooded, rational tool. Okay, that's instrumental violence. Without empathy, the reason not to use instrumental violence kind of falls away. Like, why would I not hurt you? If hurting you doesn't affect me. I mean, if that's the case, then we do need deterrence. Then it does need to be, well, if you don't care whether you hurt people, we're going to radically restrict you, or we're going to hurt you back. And that's what the deterrence model. But without the empathy, instrumental violence becomes much easier for people. The other thing that we're talking about is the regulation, the ability to regulate negative feelings, to manage them, to feel frustrated with people, to feel scared of being abandoned, to feel jealousy, all of those feelings. If those feelings are totally overwhelming, then there's a great risk that the way in which that being overwhelmed will be expressed will be in aggressive ways, in destructive ways. And so we'll see in the next few weeks, it'll be really interesting, watch these connections between people being overwhelmed by feelings of humiliation, feelings of jealousy, feelings of frustration, and becoming violent towards other people. And that's because the emotional regulation that positive caring cycle brings into being isn't strong enough. And so here, we're not talking about the risk of instrumental violence. This is the risk of expressive violence, the violence of overwhelming passions, emotions, rage, those kind of violence, which are very, very common, particularly between people who are close to each other. And so that chaotic attachment actually leads to this risk of both instrumental and expressive violence by not creating the capacity for empathy strong enough, and not creating the capacity for emotional self-regulation strongly enough. So leading to both of these potential kinds of violence. So think about that. Think about how we started talking about these three kind of psychological, the social learning model. I become violent because I see other people doing it. I become violent because of kind of repressed trauma. I'm overwhelmed by these feelings. They burst out in stressful situations, and I go crazy and destructive, self-destructive, abusive towards others, full of rage, those kind of things. And the attachment theory, which says that the certain attachment styles they actually create the capacity for empathy. They create the capacity for self-regulation that allow people not to act destructively, even in stressful situations. Whereas other attachment styles, particularly the attachment styles associated with neglect and abuse, make it much harder for people to feel those connections, to manage their own distressing emotional states, and thus produce the risk of them becoming violent towards others.